suppose you play a very small game with me. And then suppose I were to throw this piece of chalk to you, and you caught it. And then suppose I were to say, what did I throw you? How would you answer my question? Now, there are some automatic, obvious ways of answering my question. And when I've done this with many, many students and games somewhat more sophisticated than this, trying for the same objective, most people will reply with a statement. What did I throw you? A piece of chalk, or a round, long, cylindrical object, or an object with which you write on the blackboard, or something made of calcium carbonate. Or what did I throw you? An object that you can buy in the store that was produced someplace. And then I will ask the student, is there any other way that you could answer my question without doing it with these words? Because when you give me words in answer to my question, it is possible for me to say, when you say a piece of chalk, for me to say, no, I didn't. I didn't throw you a piece of chalk. And at this point, frequently, my students look at me with dismay and wonderment. What happened to him? Where was he last night? But there is a very important sense in which I could say, no, ma'am, no, sir, I did not throw you a piece of chalk. Those are words. I didn't throw you the words piece of chalk or the words cylindrical object. What I threw was something which is not a word, but which words point to. I threw you, and sometimes it's good to say, maybe we ought to keep still for a moment and look. And thus, were you to play my role, reverse our role, and were you to say to me, what did I throw you? Instead of answering piece of chalk, I would have my choice of saying, that is, there are two ways of answering a question, a verbal way and a non-verbal way. And when Johnny asks an adult, Dad, what's the moon? You have two choices. You can give him a lot of words, or you can take him by the hand and proceed to point. That is, there is a verbal way and a non-verbal way. Now then, you and I live in the kind of society, the kind of cultural organization where we put a tremendous premium on becoming vocal and on talking almost from birth. Notice how readily adults talk to infants when the infants are in the crib. For most of us, we are surrounded with words and with talking almost from the moment of our birth. Now, not all people are. You may remember when Helen Keller writes the story of my life, there is just one small dramatic moment that I should like to read about. She says, the most important day I remember in all my life is the one on which my teacher, Anne Mansfield Sullivan, came to me. I'm filled with wonder when I consider the immeasurable contrast between the two lives which it connects. It was the 3rd of March, 1887, 3 months before I was 7 years old. And I'll skip. The morning after my teacher came, she led me into her rooms and gave me a doll. When I had played with it a little while, Miss Sullivan slowly spelled into my hand the word D-O-L-L. I was at once interested in this finger play and tried to imitate it. When I finally succeeded in making the letters correctly, I was flushed with childish pleasure and pride. I did not know that I was spelling a word, or even that words existed. In the days that followed, I learned to spell in this comprehending way a great many words, among them pen, hat, cup, and a few verbs like sit, stand, and walk. But my teacher had been with me several weeks before I understood that everything has a name. And I'll skip some more. We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word water. First slowly, then rapidly. I stood still, my whole attention fixed upon the motions of her fingers. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness as of something forgotten, a thrill of returning thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful, cool something that was flowing over my hand. And she goes on. And the only point I should like to make is a very simple one. For Miss Helen Keller had to wait until she was 7 before she recognized that words existed. For us, we sometimes are astonished to realize that there are many adults who grow to adulthood somehow seemingly unaware in the presence of all the great torrent of words to which we're subjected, that there are things as well as words, and that very often we never bother to answer our questions and lots of other things too by looking to the facts, which are not words. So engrossed, so enmeshed, so imprisoned are we in the atmosphere of the verbal in which we live so much of the time. Indeed, there are for many people far more deeply organized responses to words than to things which are not words. Now, I remember a very homely example myself. I was at a dinner party in Florida, and our host was a very generous person who had supper served buffet style on his veranda, and there were many plates full of succulent dishes, and people sampled widely and well, and after eating, we sat around in a semicircle on the veranda looking out to the Atlantic Ocean, and our host came in with a kind of roguish glint in his eye. He turned to everybody and said, everybody, did you taste the food in the silver platter in the center of the table? And everybody had. And then he looked up and said, what do you suppose that stuff was? Well, my guess was it may have been cold chicken or cold pork, and the guesses ranged around that. It was some sort of conventional food. Well, after everybody had guessed this, he turned and said, snake steaks. And I remember vividly a young lady at the far end of the semicircle who turned an ashen grayish green and then had the unhappy experience of seeing her dinner for the second time. Now, please note, she ate the food, she digested it, it was becoming part of her, and her response was normal, conventional, ordinary. But when someone said snake steaks, her response to the words was exceedingly dramatic and cataclysmic. It almost looks to me as though, for her, the word is a stimulus for far deeper effects than the food itself. And we're astonished to discover so often, and the evidence is very great, that people sometimes see utterly differently under the influence of a word. It's a very simple demonstration test that we sometimes give. It consists of a big sheet of paper with daubs of color spread on about a foot long, and there are various colors, and we ask subjects to rank them according to the pleasantness and unpleasantness. If it's number 1 down to 10, and we'll do this 2 or 3 times with the same people to see if they are regularizing their ranking. Then we will give about some weeks later the same set of colors, but this time each color is accompanied by a word, an adjective, like mottled yellow, meadow gold, bilious green, crude, faded, warm sandstone. And then we discover, when we ask the people to rank them again, the rankings change. They tend to rank the colors in terms of the pleasantness or unpleasantness of the associations around the word, more with the result that they tend to like colors they liked before, they now tend to dislike. So that from one point of view, if a person is more interested in the associations surrounding the word, and his response is more dramatic to them than to the fact the words stand for, that may well be one variety of unrealistic behavior. And it may be that if we pursue this, we'll have a definition of what it means to be realistic. I'd like to show you a map. This is a map that was just made in fun. It was sort of a game. Some of my Texan friends may enjoy it. It's a Texan's view of the United States, in which Texas looms large and wonderful and enormous. This is made in fun. It's a jest. Whether the jest has any significance or not is unimportant. But the map allows me to make a point on this word things business that I should like to pursue. Note what the map did. It exaggerated tremendously. We find it very helpful to think of words and talking as a kind of continuous map-making. Thus, just as a map can fit the territory, what I say about anything can fit it. If, for example, I say that this is not cylindrical, it's 5-dimensional, or something of the sort, my map may not fit. Or if I say that there are 3 of these, my language does not fit. Now, one of the very interesting effects, we think, that comes from our failure sharply to realize when we're in the realm of the verbal and when we're in the realm of the nonverbal is the deeply ingrained, exaggerating tendency that occurs in our speech. And I should like to try to provide one or two illustrations of how easy it is for us to exaggerate in our talking, just as it's easy for a map maker to distort a map. Indeed, to make an accurate map is a very great achievement. It takes countless observations and a great deal of very technical work to make a map fit the territory. I now want to suggest that in our everyday talking, we are more likely to distort and exaggerate than we think. And secondly, that it will take an active effort to be accurate and precise and to avoid the exaggeration. And I'd like to show you this in two or three very simple ways. Suppose, for example, I were to ask you a very simple question about some great figure. Say, for example, I were to say to you, what are some of say something about Wendell Willkie's political philosophy. And I were to ask several people at once, what are some of the things they're likely to say? Oh, when I ask someone that, he's likely to say, Wendell Willkie believed in one world. And I would write that out, in one world. Or Wendell Willkie was a great Republican. Or they're likely to say Wendell Willkie had a philosophy that would remove the power from the federal government, or something. In other words, we will make a quickly categorizing statement. Thus, for example, if I were to say to you, say something about Shakespeare as a playwright, you might say Shakespeare was a great playwright, or something. Shakespeare was a man who introduced poetry, great poetry, into his plays. Now, I want to argue, as for the moment, that the form of this sentence is enormously exaggerating because it doesn't take into account something that is very easy to demonstrate. May I show you? May I give you a 1-minute biography of Wendell Willkie, which is enormously oversimplifying, and I trust you'll take that into account. But between 1910 and 1914, Wendell Willkie was an undergraduate at Indiana University. And during that period, he was editor of a very irreverent magazine called Bogus. And in Bogus, all sorts of articles severely critical of the faculty were regularly printed. In addition, Mr. Willkie, in his first 2 years, was a debater. And one of the subjects debated widely was the abolition of inheritance. And there is evidence to indicate that Mr. Willkie, by choice, debated on the side which said that inheritances should be abolished. He didn't think it fair for some boys and girls to start out with more income than their friends. He opposed the fraternities, fought them furiously, because he once said the Greeks, meaning the fraternities, get most of the breaks on the campus, and that isn't fair. Nevertheless, in his last year, he joined one of the very largest ones. He graduated, went to law school, came out of law school, did some campaigning in the 20s for a man who was elected to Congress, but who was badly smeared and discredited in some congressional investigations. And let's take Mr. Willkie through the 20s into the early 30s, where he was essentially a public relations man for several, at least winding up one very great public utility. That is, he was in the worst possible sense, I could say, a front man. He was a public relations figure. He was not the kind of businessman that ran the company. He gave speeches and so on. And then came his campaign for the presidential office, running against Mr. Roosevelt. And then finally, after his defeat, his travel around the world. Now, if you will permit me to be very loose, I think it could be said that in his undergraduate years at Indiana, Mr. Willkie was a young progressive, a very liberal young man. That is, he was a young maverick, exceedingly critical. In his 20s and 30s, he was an exceedingly conservative, you might almost say, reactionary person. Then in the late 30s, I think you could say he ran on a very liberal Republican platform. And then in his last 2 years, after the trip around the world, you could say that he was almost spiritually kin to the New Deal. You could almost say that when he returned from his round-the-world trip. Now, it is easy to say Mr. Wendell Willkie believed in one world. But when I say that, what is implied? Mr. Willkie believed in one world when? What seems to be lurking around the corners of the phrase, he believed in one world? May I add the omitted phrase, all the time. He believed in one world all the time. When I say something about Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote great poetry. The implication is all the time. But any look at the man, any look at the plays will indicate that Wendell Willkie was a man who changed. He went from exceeding liberalism to exceeding conservatism to something else. But it is easy to catch Mr. Willkie in a phrase to say he believed he was a good Republican. But that doesn't begin to catch the variety and the variations. And if you will watch the kinds of talking around you, note how easy it is to peg someone, to say, Johnny is a bad boy. And note how hard it is for a person to bring in, he's a bad boy when? Well, this afternoon when he tried to saw the legs off the piano at home. But when we say Johnny is a bad boy, note how there seems to be hidden all the time. And in our studies of how people behave with each other, a supervisor who comes to say, that man's lazy, he's pegged, and then from that point on, it takes an active effort for that supervisor to realize he's lazy in these periods when I knew him. But unless we put the date on there, unless we say when, the implication is all the time. Every now and then I do some elementary conversations, counseling with advisees that I have at the university. And I remember vividly one kind of problem that I see over and over. Something happened to a boy or a girl. He failed some courses. He had some social difficulties. He lost his job or something. Let me just talk about one of them, typical of many. He came to my office. He looked at me and he said, I want to leave school. I want to quit. I'm a failure. I can't do it. He says, I'm a failure. It's very easy to hear the overtones. I'm a failure now and for all the time. And invariably, in these circumstances, I will say, you're a failure when? And invariably, one of these youngsters will say, what do you mean when? I'm a failure. And I will say, when? My whole attempt being to break him of the exaggerating tendency, I am a failure for all time. Because we have come to believe, if you say, I am a failure for all time, the depth of your distress will be far greater and deeper than if you say, I'm a failure this year. And part of what constitutes therapy, part of what constitutes release for this boy, is to make him realize, at the end of the first semester, 1952, I am a failure. But that doesn't say anything about 1953. I am a failure this afternoon, and I admit that. But what he tends to do is to think, I am a failure now, I've always been one, I always will be. And thus, the mere imposition into our thinking of something that our language use lacks, the date, the dimension of time, we find sometimes does something. I remember one particular boy who said, when I said when, he said, that's right. I then went on to say, were you a failure last year? No, I had a job, everything was all right. You think you'll be a failure next year? Well, I don't know. Now, the moment he comes to that mood, something happens. He's ready to keep on going. He isn't ready to quit. I remember a committee at another university that had to review applicants for admission to the graduate school. This is a story of a boy, let's call him Dick, who went to a very small school in Ohio, had a good time. Whenever he got a grade better than a C, he invariably got another grade poorer than a C. That is, if he ever got a B, you may be sure that the next marking period, he'd get a D. He was an average student, and he had a good time and didn't do very much study, and graduated with a, as we say, gentleman's C average for 4 years. Came the war, he went into the Air Force, and in 5 years had a brilliant military record. So brilliant that he was invited to stay on for a regular commission, was commissioned to captain, and as part of the Air Force's career program, was permitted to take time off to go to university to see if he could get a bachelor's degree. But when his request for admission, the admission committee looked at it and said, why, this fella, Captain Dick, is a C student. He's a C student. We can't have C students in our graduate school. A B is necessary for admission. And that's what I mean by the exaggerating tendency. To say that Dick is a C student is to exaggerate enormously. He was a C student between 1936 and 1940. And the tendency of our exaggeration is not to look at the thing. It is to be imprisoned in the phrase. He is a C student. But he was a C student from 1936 to 1940. And how easy it is to pin that brand on him as if he never will change. And to the degree that we fail to look at him, to that degree is what we say about him distorting. I ran onto a somewhat moderately amusing illustration of a lady who didn't want to go get her teeth out because she didn't want to go to visit the dentist to save her teeth because, as she said, I don't want to go to him. He hurts. That dentist hurt me. And it was a very amusing analysis we made of her talking, because when she says the dentist hurts, what's implied? A little bit or all the time? And she implies the latter. We asked her to sit down at the blackboard where I did something very simple. We said, what time was your meeting with him? 2 o'clock. What do you do the first 5 minutes between 2:02 and 2:05? Oh, not much. He just looked at my teeth. Did he hurt then? Oh, no. Then what did he do? Well, at 2:10, he started to dig around. Did it hurt then? Oh, no. Then what did he do? Then he started to drill. And, sir, he liked to kill me. In the period, 2:10, 12, that's when the dentist hurt. Did he hurt after that? Oh, no, not till the time I left. Didn't hurt at all. But when you say the dentist hurts, that's bigger. That's deeper than if you say he hurt from 2:10 to 2:12. And the failure to catch that distinction means that she enlarges her fear. It means that the dentist is a terrible figure. It means that he's a person to be avoided. May I show you this in the life of a little boy? There's a little boy named David who was bitten by a squirrel. And the pediatrician prescribed 14 daily anti-rabies shots every day. The first day, he cried only when the needle entered his arm. That is, may I make a very small, I'll make a little circle. When the needle went into his arm, he cried. The second day, he was reluctant to enter the doctor's office. He began to cry when they got right outside the office. The third day, he cried on entering the building. The area of his crying expanded. The fourth day, he didn't want to leave home. Now, if one analyzes his talking in all this period, one gets from him the doctor hurts. It hurts, and there's a continuous broadening. He never says to himself, the doctor hurts when he pokes the needle into my arm. He says, the doctor hurts. This terrific exaggeration until finally, on the fifth day, he said, Mommy, I don't want to have a shot today. Well, his mother then began to do a little of what we call semantic retraining, general semantic retraining, and she went on like this. She said, yes, David, you will have a shot today, but I will tell you about it. When the doctor takes your arm, it hurts, and you want to cry. That's all right. You may cry when it hurts, but does it hurt now? Notice she's dating. You may cry when it hurts. Does it hurt now? Does it hurt when we ride in the car and park in the lot? Does it hurt when we go into the building through the revolving door? Does it hurt then? No. You don't need to cry when we push the door round and round. You can laugh then. Does it hurt when we sit in the doctor's waiting room and read the picture book? Does it hurt when the doctor takes your arm? Yes, that hurts. Then you cry. Go ahead. When he's all finished, you don't need to cry anymore, and it hurts only a minute, so you can cry for just a minute. David seemed to get it. En route that day, his mother asked from time to time, does it hurt now? Remember, David is 2.5 when this happened. He even laughed when he said no, and during the remaining 10 days, he cried only when the needle hit him. Now, this was a miracle. Never mind the skill and sagacity of the mother. What is important here is that already in a 2.5, one finds this exaggerating, this tremendous growing tendency that's there. And when it's there, it grows up into other more difficult phenomena. I have time for one more quick, overly quick illustration of this in another way. I try a little game with an audience. I give a speech, or I have someone else give a speech, in which he says, in the Bible, there is something about leprosy which is not up to date. Medical science today has a great deal of knowledge about leprosy, which is different from the attitudes toward leprosy implied in the Old Testament. And the speaker makes very clear that he's doing nothing more in his talk about the Old Testament, but talk about this little bit of it having to do with leprosy and some of the strange implications. The speaker does not deal with leprosy as a moral taint. He merely says there are some things in which the Bible is slightly inaccurate. And that's all he does. He talks about that little bit. Then his talk goes on for 10 minutes, and the audience afterwards is given a small, very simple questionnaire to fill out, and there are a lot of unimportant questions, but one important one. If you were to classify or talk about this man, how would you consider him today? In almost every case we've done this, and it makes no difference the sophistication of the audience. At least half of the people will say, oh, that man hates the Bible. He's an agnostic or an atheist. He's a Bible hater. Notice how that expanded from he hated a little bit of it, he disliked a little bit of it, to he disliked it. Now, in our world, the exaggerating tendency makes things very difficult for those people who wish to be moderate. Indeed, if there were time, I should like to say that the moment in world history in which we now live, it is very difficult to be a moderate. It is hard to be against something in a small way. It is hard to be against something in a fraction of the elements. People immediately want to push you. They want to exaggerate. They want you to be against the Bible. Now, I think one ought to be able to criticize the Bible. One ought to be able to talk about reforms in government. One ought to be able to talk about reforms in our social life without immediately being blown up into a wild-eyed radical. Now, I submit that in the moments of our talking and in living, whenever we fail to keep our eyes on the ongoing, complicated, richly various facts of the world in which we live, when we think only of the words we use, we're then in danger of being blinded. It is one of those obvious things to say, of course words are not things. But sometimes this is so obvious that in the hurry and scurry and give and take of daily living, we tend to lose that. And if we tend to lose the obvious and to become oblivious of it, then trouble must be inevitable.
Dr. Irving J. Lee, professor of speech at Northwestern University, has just completed the next to the last of his 6 talks on the problems of talking sense. The next time we meet him, he will close this series of television half-hours as he discusses the man who knows it all.